Okay. Hello, everyone. We'll just get started in just a few moments. Thank you for joining us. All right. Well, thank you, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jackie Rocha. I am the Executive Director of Saint-Gaudens Memorial, the philanthropic partner of Saint-Gaudens National Historical Park in Cornish, New Hampshire. For more information on our organization and upcoming events, we encourage you to log on our website, that's stgaudens.org, which I'll drop in the chat. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's talk, Memory and Imagination, Stanford White in Detail, presented by architect, author, and Saint-Gaudens Memorial trustee, Sam White. Sam brings a truly unique perspective to this subject, both as a practicing architect and as the great-grandson of Stanford White. Tonight, he'll be exploring the signature ornamental details that animate his great-grandfather's work and the broader themes that tie together White's designs across a full span of his career. This talk draws directly on Sam's book, Stanford White in Detail. It's a beautiful volume, and I encourage everyone who's enjoying tonight's presentation to pick up a copy. I'm going to drop the link of the Villard Press in the chat where you can find it and you can purchase it. And now I will leave it to you, Sam, for our presentation.
Thank you, Jackie. You can hear me? Okay. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us. It is a pleasure to be in hyperspace with you. Well, the themes that Jackie was talking about uh, include Stanford White's collaborations with other artists and architects, the unique manner in which he used ornament, and in particular, the source of the inspiration for his extraordinary designs. And that inspiration arose from a synthesis, I believe, of two factors, his memory and his imagination. Now, everyone has memory and imagination to some degree. But in Stanford White's case, the combination was like rocket fuel. He was able to employ historic forms as raw material and interpret them in designs that were both reassuringly familiar at the same time that they were authentically original. The brilliant effects that he achieved through that combination, I think, made him one of the most important designers in the history of American architecture. Just see here. Okay. Well, the facts of Stanford White's life are pretty straightforward. He was born in New York in 1853. He was murdered also in New York in 1906. And when he was 19 years old, and with the help of his father's friends, he got a job as a apprentice in the office of Henry Hobson Richardson, who was then the most important living American architect. It was during this period that Stanford White met and started really a lifelong friendship with Augustus Saint-Gaudens. But he served Richardson well. He stayed there for 6 years. He rose to become Richardson's principal assistant. And in 1878, he left for a 14-month sabbatical in Europe, returning in 1879 to join William Meade and Charles McKim. And those three architects, I think, represented an unusual combination of compatible personalities and complementary artistic temperaments that made for an instant success. And within 25 years, McKim, Meade, and White grew from a small atelier of, say, 10 architects to become the largest and most famous architecture firm in the world. Well, Stanford White was born with his imagination, but the process of acquiring memory requires a certain amount of legwork. And in the mid-1870s, together with his friends McKim and Meade, they weren't yet partners, but they knew each other and liked each other. They went off on what they would later refer to as their celebrated New England walking tour, a trip up to Salem, New Hampshire, Salem, Massachusetts, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to see examples of late colonial and early federal period architecture. And they must have seen in Salem, Massachusetts, the Gardner Pingree House, which you see here, by Samuel McIntyre, one of the truly great examples of early American architecture, or American architecture of any period, really. And Stanford White must have been taken by the sort of the genteel, really sophistication and harmony of this elevation. But I think what he was really taken by was the front door. The front doors of these federal period houses are like street furniture. They're very elaborate, quite unlike the rest of the elevation. They have extensively paneled doors. They're surrounded by side lights and transoms with leaded glass, and then framed by columns. And 25 years after Stanford White saw this, he was able to use it in a house that he was working on in Southampton for James Breeze, a house called The Orchard. And the house is interesting. It's a central pavilion with these central mass with these sort of exterior pavilions that are spaced apart from the house, and they're connected to each other by these hyphens, which Stanford White treats as exterior spaces with the lattice walls and ceilings, the tile floor, and reinforcing the exterior nature of this connection, in this case, to the music room, by giving it a front door. Well, the trip to Europe, the sabbatical, started actually with a sort of a 3-week trip down the Rhone with his two best friends, St. Gaudens and Charles McKim. McKim went over on the boat with Stanford White. McKim was escaping a sort of a nasty divorce at that time, but the three of them got together and they went down the Rhone to look at examples of Romanesque architecture, probably at the suggestion of Richardson. And at the end of this trip, St. Gaudens made this medal to commemorate the trip. You can see the three protagonists on the medal. There's Charles McKim with his high forehead. There is St. Gaudens with his pointed beard. And there's Stanford White looking like he stepped on a third rail, which is pretty much how he looked most of the time. And the rest of the medal is filled with mentions or little graphics, cartoons almost of some of the hijinks they got into and some of the buildings that they saw, including the building on the right, which is the Cathedral of Saint-Gilles-du-Gard in a town about just about 20 miles north of Avignon. And when Stanford White saw this, he wrote to his mother that this was the finest piece of architecture in all of France. Well, Stanford White was given to these kind of uncritical superlatives, but it is a terrific piece of architecture. And again, 25 years after Stanford White saw this, he was able to pull up the memory when he got a commission from Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt to design a set of memorial doors for her late husband. And the doors would go on the church designed by James Renwick, St. Bartholomew's, which at that time was at 44th Street and Madison Avenue. And you can see how that triple portal, fits Renwick's church like a glove. Just a terrific thing. And the congregation liked it so much that 25 years later, when they had Bertram Goodhue design a new church for them up in 50th Street, they insisted that Goodhue incorporate the triple portal into his design. Now, Goodhue was a good sport, but it must have been a real struggle to sort of reconcile this very horizontal, one-story wide triple portal with this very narrow, tall Byzantine church designed by Goodhue. But he did it, and we are the beneficiaries. William Meade said that Stanford White could draw like a house on fire. And while he was on his sabbatical, he filled, I'd say, dozens of sketchbooks with drawings like this. This is the Chateau de Plessis-Moncey in Anjou, which is just south of Lyon. And White, in this case, must have been quite taken by the sort of the medieval nature of it. It's an interesting comparison to the Gardner Pingree house that we saw earlier. But the sort of the strongly asymmetrical, almost sort of opportunistic roof line, the arch over the door in the corner there, and that wonderful texture on the underside of the projecting bay on the left. And He didn't have to wait 25 years in order to reuse this. Less than a year after Stanford White made this drawing, he was in New York designing the interior courtyard of the Newport Casino. And there you see it all, the same sort of medieval character of the elevation, the strongly asymmetrical massing, the arch over the entrance with the strongly textured spandrel panel over the door. This is an example, I'd say, of quick turnaround on the part of Stanford White. So didn't always have to cook for 25 years. Saint-Gaudens was in Paris at the time of this sabbatical, working on his first commission, the commission that really made his reputation. It was the David Glasgow Farragut statue that he had gotten. And this was the statue that really sort of changed the course of American sculpture, that up till then, statues of military heroes were relatively static affairs, and the military hero was invariably dressed in a toga. Well, not the case here. Not only is Farragut wearing contemporary military dress, but it's also Saint-Gaudens has captured a psychological instant. Farragut has seen something on the horizon. He's tensing his left arm to reach for his binoculars to see what's up. Remember, he's the damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead guy. And so it's as if Saint-Gaudens had sort of captured a nanosecond in bronze. And American sculpture sort of never looked back after this was revealed. The deal with White and Saint-Gaudens was that Stanford White would design the base and Saint-Gaudens would do the sculpture. And I don't think Stanford White's base sort of changed the course of the design of bases in American sculpture, because I don't think there are too many actors in supporting roles who would try to upstage the star in the way that Stanford White tried to do to Saint-Gaudens here. I mean, just look at the difference in size and proportion of the two things. But the base is magnificent. It is wonderfully carved with allegorical figures, with text recounting the career of Farragut in this wonderful letter forms. And then the whole thing is shaped as an exedra or an outdoor bench, really inviting you, in a sense, to come up and sit at the feet of the naval war hero. And here you get your first insight into Stanford White, besides, I would say, his ambition, which is that he insisted on making the observer an active part of his designs. Here you don't just look at this, you're really asked to come in and participate in it. Well, I think that Saint-Gaudens forgave Stanford White for trying to upstage him, because they both signed the work on the back of this crab, which is set in pebble dash in the base of the statue. And here you see Stanford White's sort of taste for the picturesque character of slightly bizarre animals. You see this as another slightly bizarre episode as well, an abstracted spider's web, which is in the balcony rail in the library of the 7th Regiment Armory. Here was a project that was a collaboration that I'll get into in a minute, but this room is really a design of Stanford White, because everything in the room is something that shows up as part of the toolkit of his early designs. You have the coved ceiling with the woven plaster basket weave, the cornflower inserts. You have the fireplace that we just saw, and then you have all of these sort of Islamic vocabulary of wood carving on the doors, which you don't see in this picture, but is there. So this is real Stanford White working pretty much on his own. And the reason is that the rest of the team was working in the next room. The rest of the team consisted of Louis Comfort Timpany in the lower left, who was the leader of what was called the Associated Artists. The team included Lockwood DeForest in the upper left, who looks like he's dressed to go to a costume party. Samuel Coleman in the upper right, who was a painter, and he was the colorist on this team. And then you have Candace Wheeler in the lower right. She ran a workshop that designed and produced the fabrics for these designs. And the Associated Artists were interior designers. They did a room in the White House. They did the house for the Havemeyers in New York. They did the Mark Twain house, which is still there in Hartford, Connecticut. And for one project, they brought Stanford White onto the team. And that one project was next door to the Silver Room. It was the Veterans Room at the 7th Regiment Armory, a room that is, I think, uh, the most, if not one of the most important aesthetic period rooms in America. It's a room that really redefines the concept of visual overload. You just don't know where to start when you walk into this room. And it's a room in which it's generally impossible, I'd say, with the exception of the stained glass, which was Tiffany, generally impossible to assign with any certainty who was responsible for what. I mean, here you have five very bright, very ambitious designers, and they all have ideas, and nobody is saying no. Well, when Stanford White was at Richardson's office, the paradigm was the Beaux-Arts paradigm, which was the architect was the leader of the team of artists and craftsmen. And this is an example of White's leadership of such a team. This is the Church of the Ascension on Fifth Avenue and Ninth Street, designed by Richard Upjohn for a congregation that insisted that Upjohn create a nave that did not have any chancel because chancels were the scene of all kinds of popish doings. So Upjohn sort of backs the nave right up to the rectory. You couldn't extend it. And so 50 years later or 40 years later, the congregation has moved to the left or the right theologically, depending on how you count. And they wanted a chancel. And so Stanford White had to create a chancel where there was none. And he does it for the most part by sort of cladding the last bay of this nave in sienna marble, which is wonderful, relatively expensive, but delicious stuff. And he teams up with a wonderful team, starting with John Lafarge, who's in the lower right, who does the mural of the Rising Christ. Now, Lafarge is important because he is the man who convinced Stanford White not to become a painter, but instead to become an architect. So he's an important figure here. In the upper right is Louis Saint-Gaudens, the brother of Augustus. He was responsible for those angels that are over the altar. And then the lower left, you have Maitland Armstrong, who was a designer of mosaics and stained glass, and he did the mosaics behind the altar. This is a sort of a terrific team, and they really did sort of come up with a solution that sort of defied Upjohn's best efforts. Well, the collaborations that Stanford White is most famous for, of course, are his collaborations with Charles McKim, who's on the right, and William Rutherford Mead on the left. And when they started out, they were in a relatively small office. They took over Richardson's office in Lower Broadway. And I think the early work of the firm sort of shows the unintended consequences of what happens when you put two very talented designers, in this case, McKim and White, into a relatively small office. Remember, drafting boards take a lot of room, and there were about 10 people in this room. And I think that there was this general sort of free-for-all competition for who could control or even contribute to any of the early designs. And I think you'll see that if you look at this early house, which is the Samuel Tilton House in Newport. And here you have the south elevation of the Tilton House. This, I would say, is 100% pure McKim. He got what he wanted. You see the great gable that sort of organizes the whole composition, a strongly asymmetrical arrangement below of the projecting bay and the deep recess. The windows organized into these long, continuous horizontal bands with sort of panels connecting the glazing. McKim does this very, very well, and this is a wonderful McKim elevation. But as you move around to the other elevations, you see Stanford White clawing his way back into the game. I mean, gone are the long, continuous horizontals. You have elements that Stanford White saw on his sabbatical in northern France, starting with that panel in the upper right called a sgraffito panel, which is sort of seashells and broken glass, little rocks sort of pushed into wet cement to create a picture. And then on the left, you have half timbering with pebble dash infill. And then below that, you have a leaded glass window with these little panes of glass that are the size of postage stamps. I mean, it's a wonderful sort of textural effect. And if you move to the north elevation, Stanford White is now completely in control. You have the pebble dash infill for the half timbering, the leaded glass, and then that extraordinary sgraffito panel, which has bits of broken beer bottles pushed into the wet cement. I mean, Stanford White must have gotten up onto the scaffold in order to do this, because you could never communicate something like this with a drawing or in a letter. He must have been in Newport on the scaffold working away. So that is an autograph Stanford White, in my view. But when you got to the interior, it was more of a question of a clear assignment of roles than a competition for participation. McKim and Mead had brought Stanford White into the partnership because they realized that they were quite weak at designing interiors. And when you look at this, I think you will agree that they made a good decision. The interior here is arranged according to a device that McKim and Richardson were developing when Richardson was working, when McKim was working for Richardson in the early 70s, which was the living hall plan, where you'd have a space that was sort of spiritually and functionally at the center of the house. It had the staircase, it had an ingle nook, it had a fireplace, it had the front door, and all the other rooms sort of lead off this center living hall like blades off a pinwheel. This is McKim working away at the plan, but Stanford White's imagination is hard at work at everything else. Stanford White was, in fact, weak at exteriors. He was strong at interiors when he started. And so when he or the firm got the commission from Henry Villard to do 5 houses as a great single block up on Madison Avenue and 50th Street, the decision was made to let Joseph Morrill Wells develop this. Wells was an important employee in the office. We'll get to him in a minute, but he decided that the firm's sort of, I'd say, slightly watered down Richardsonian work up to that point in terms of elevations was not as good as it should be, or not appropriate to New York. And he thought that they should kind of grow up and look at the Italian Renaissance. And so Wells bases the elevations that he developed on the Palazzo della Cancelleria in Rome, and works this through. And remember, this is a small office. Everybody can see what everybody's doing. And so clearly the partners agreed that this was a good direction to go in. But Stanford White was in charge of the interiors. Here's a collaboration between Stanford White and Augustus Saint-Gaudens. It's called the Zodiac Clock, and it's on the stairway. And if you sort of look over your left shoulder when you're climbing the stair and hold firmly to the handrail, you can admire this really remarkable and I think unusual bit of interior design from these two great artists. Well, when you get to the top of the stairs, you see Stanford White at work, seeing how much of Henry Villard's money he can spend. He covers the walls with the sienna marble, hires Maitland Armstrong to do the stained glass windows, and then creates these extraordinary details, such as those upturned volutes on the Capitol and those balusters, which sort of look like damask rendered in stone. Well, in working on these elevations, Stanford White did collaborate with Joseph Morrill Wells. And Wells here is an interesting character. He is exactly Stanford White's age, born in 1853. Like Stanford White, he was only educated through a series of apprenticeships. He was self-taught in a way. But there the similarity ends. He was an introvert. He was antisocial. He was a crank, but he was a perfectionist, a workaholic. He did not suffer fools gladly, and he had beautiful taste. And he would do these extraordinary things. White would make a sketch on yellow trace and put it down on Wells' desk, and Wells would work it out. It's said that McKim offered Wells a partnership at one point, and Wells turned it down, saying that he would never put his name on so much damn bad work. So you see in the right-hand side, there's possibly Wells in the music room of the Villard Houses, and he looks pretty tired, which he should have, because I'll bet he practically worked himself to death on this house in which every square inch has been designed. And in fact, Wells did eventually work himself to death. He died quite young in 1890, and his gravestone was designed by Stanford White and carved by Augustus Saint-Gaudens. It's a remarkable thing. It's 10 feet tall and just absolutely beautiful. I heard from a friend of mine a couple of years ago that this stone was which is up in Medford, Massachusetts, at the Oak Grove Cemetery, was in distress. And so I went up there to take a look at it, and that in distress was actually putting it rather mildly, that this stone, I think, for the last 50 years had been broken and sitting in the mud. And so I got a bunch of friends together, and we put the money up, and we hired somebody to restore the stone. And now, if you're going past the Oak Grove Cemetery in Medford, Massachusetts, I strongly recommend that you see this sort of collaboration of St. Gaudens and Stanford White that they did in honor of their really good friend, Joe Wells. It's a really remarkable piece, and it was an honor to be able to work on it. Well, Wells's death was a blow to Stanford White, but he could keep going. I mean, as they say in baseball, Stanford White could play every position. And if you want to see an example of what Stanford White does on his own when he's not sort of fighting for participation with Charles McKim, take a look at this house. This is called the Alden Villa. It's in Cornwall, Pennsylvania, which is near Lancaster, and it's a pretty far from New York. I mean, even today in a car with the gas pedal down, it's like 3.5 hours from New York City. But in those days, it must have been practically an all-day train ride. And as Stanford White was the junior partner, he probably drew the short straw and was sent out to take a look at the site, which he did. And then went back to the train station and took the all-day train ride back to New York. And I am convinced that by the time Stanford White got back to New York, he had designed this house because it has everything that he is interested in and nothing of what McKim is interested in. I mean, starting with the general massing, which is much more complex than McKim would have allowed. You have medieval touches, the projecting porte cochere with its half timbering and pink stucco infill, that wonderful organization of windows just to the left of the porte cochere, very different from the continuous horizontals that McKim liked. And then you have details such as the lattice and the arch by that window over the staircase, and just generally not a McKim house. This is a Stanford White house early because he's working his way through doing houses like this on his own. White did sign the house. I mean, there are these sgraffito panels all over the exterior, almost as if to say, well, you know, I was here and I did this house. So this is signed Stanford White, and it's a wonderful way to sign it. So we'll give it to him. My favorite part of the exterior of the house is this projecting bay on the back, which rises up to become that open porch, and then that sort of candle snuffer roof with the two different roof slopes that are set apart with that wonderfully decorative flashing line, and then all topped with that sort of explosion of wire. But the best part are those columns that are sort of bending to support the weight of the roof. And here again, you have White insisting that the observer sort of get engaged in the work. You look at that and you feel the stress. I call this the architecture of empathy, and this is how Stanford White liked to bring you into his designs. Well, when you get to the interior of the house, you start to run through a number of the themes that I'd be talking about, starting with sort of memory and imagination. In terms of memory, the ceiling in the vestibule is based on a plate out of a book called The Elements of Arab Art, published in Paris just when Stanford White arrived for his sabbatical. And then the screen that's at the bottom of the staircase is called a mashrabia screen. It's a North African device intended to create privacy and allow for ventilation. It's the series of little pieces of wood that are pegged together. But what Stanford White loved about this was that the light passing through it revealed the kind of intricacy and detail of the pieces of wood pegged together. And then as more and more light passes through it, it starts to dissolve all that texture. And that idea of texture texture that was first revealed and then dissolved by light is something that you'll see throughout Stanford White's portfolio. That's memory. As far as imagination, well, take a look. I mean, the paneling on the door, the multiple different types of beaded board or end block paneling on the wood, the light fixtures that look like they're taken out of an opium den. There's a lot of memory in this space. And there's also another theme of as a processional architecture that Stanford White likes to move you through his spaces. And the way he does it is with a combination of compression and release. And here, this space shows compression in two ways. It's compression spatially because it's not a very big space for a vestibule for a country house. I mean, this is a big house, and they could have made a bigger vestibule, but it's compressed. You come in there, and you really physically want to get on to the next place. But then it's also compression visually. I mean, can you imagine trying to fit another idea into this space? I mean, it's Stanford White sort of ran out of room before he ran out of ideas. And so that combination drives you into the next room, which is the release. This is the 2.5-story living room. Here, the half timbering and the infill are smooth and flush with each other instead of the pebble dash that you saw on the outside. The panels between the timbers have gold stars that have been stenciled onto them. The fireplace and chimney is a very domesticated version of a sort of a medieval fireplace. And then the whole room is bathed in light from those 12 leaded glass windows at the end. So this is release as opposed to the compression that you were in just a second ago. The next room in this procession is the dining room, and here you have pure imagination. The ceiling has been painted a sort of a green blue and then covered with fishnet, a glued fishnet right to the ceiling. The walls have that reeded fabric on the upper half, and then the marquetry blocks on the lower half. The sideboard has this wonderful hardware, and those panels are so created out of bronze upholstery tacks in various patterns. But I think the most interesting thing about the sideboard is that it represents what I would call the estuarial middle ground between architecture and furniture. I mean, look at the crown mold at the top, which is tied into the architecture of the room, but look at the legs at the bottom, which suggests that this is in fact a freestanding piece of furniture. Stanford White loved the ambiguity that this created. It gave a little sort of energy and imbalance to a room that he thought was an important part of making a room go. There's a painted room in the house. This is painted in Stanford White's favorite color scheme of gold and ivory. And it also has Stanford White's favorite sort of vocabulary of moldings, very different from the sort of the standard Vitruvian moldings that are the sort of staple of classical architects. This is what Stanford White made his moldings out of. I call them bundled reeds. And he combines them with these little staccato pinpoints. You see it on that octagonal frame on the left that would have enclosed a mirror. And it's very much like what Stanford White did for the frames that he was designing in this period. Stanford White was the great frame designer of the late 19th century. And so if you have a painting with a real Stanford White frame around it, it better be a pretty good painting because otherwise the frame is going to be worth more. Well, here's another Stanford White frame. This is done in a more, I'd say, conventionally Renaissance approach, but it encloses a bas-relief by Saint-Gaudens, which was a present to Stanford White on the occasion of his marriage to Bessie Springs Smith in February 1884. And from that point on, Stanford White is a married man. Well, the couple go off to Europe on a honeymoon, possibly stopping in Spain, but certainly going as far as Constantinople, because that's where this wonderful picture of the young architect was taken. But they spend most of their time going up and down the peninsula in Italy, and I'm convinced that it was during this trip Stanford White decided that Joe Wells was probably right and that the Italian Renaissance was, in fact, what New York needed, and it needed a lot of it. And so White gets back and he takes, for example, this church, which is in Rome. It's called the Santa Maria in Cosmedin. it's a place where you take your 12-year-old child to, stick his or her hand in the lion's mouth to see if they're lying. I mean, it's a real tourist trap. But Stanford White really cared about the tower, and he takes the tower and he puts it on top of the Judson Memorial down on 3rd Street, just south of Washington Square. And think about New York at this period. It was typically a 2 or 3 story town, but the church steeples all came up, and they created the skyline, and they were all those sharp points, so that when this started coming up over the tree line, it must have been quite a shock. And it really announced that there was a new sheriff in town, a message reinforced by Stanford White when he took this high Renaissance doorway and put that on the entrance to the Judson Memorial. It all makes it worth a trip down to 3rd Street to admire. Well, my favorite of these sort of Renaissance combines of Stanford White's are these two buildings here. A building on the left is in Verona. It's called the Loggia del Consigli, which is the porch of the lawyers. The building on the right, as you know, is the Torre Orologio of the St. Mark's Square clock tower. And Stanford White looks at these two buildings and he sort of inhales them. And what he exhales is this building here, which was the headquarters of the New York Herald newspaper, an entire newspaper operation on a single trapezoidal block, which is where Broadway crosses 6th Avenue at 34th Street. This is building owned by White's client for the Newport Casino, James Gordon Bennett, but it had an entire newspaper operation in a single building, the editorial offices, the business offices, and the newspaper production. And here White is making this incredible present to the city. I mean, not only is this just a beautiful building to look at, but if you were walking down Broadway and you stepped in through that open arcade on the left, looked through the plate glass windows, you would look down into the basement and see the newspaper actually being printed. I mean, this was sort of entertainment of the first rank. And this is Stanford White getting the Observer to engaged in his architecture. This is the building that Charles McKim said was the finest piece of architecture produced by their firm. And it's the building by McKim and White that I most regret is no longer there. Well, if they did stop in Spain on their honeymoon trip, they might have stopped in Seville to see this building here. This is called the Giralda, which means weather vane. It started off life as a minaret in a mosque, but after the expulsion of the Moors, it was taken over by the Christians, attached to the cathedral, then built up, sort of decorated with a lot of Renaissance details, and then topped with a statue of the Archangel Michael, who revolves around as the wind changes direction. The word Giralda means weather vane. And Stanford White, if he didn't see this, certainly knew about it, because that's what he used really as his model for the tower for Madison Square Garden that he and Joe Wells developed with the help, I'd say, of the steel framing, which allowed him to make it taller and sort of leaner than the load-bearing construction of the Giralda. But here it was topped with a very undressed statue of Diana, who would rotate in the wind. And thanks to the array of lights at her feet that you can see in this image, at night, Diana could be seen from as far away as Greenwich, Connecticut. And the saying, though, was that during the day she was surrounded by armies of clubmen with binoculars. Anyway, Diana was the first nude in public display in America, really, and it became a symbol of New York and a symbol now of the American Renaissance. Well, the Tower of Madison Square Garden was just part of what was an extraordinary gift to the public. This is a building, I think, that changed New Yorkers' expectations of what to demand from their public architecture. A building that gives so much, both inside and outside. Outside, it just made it a pleasure to walk past. Inside, it had an opera house that said to have one of the finest theaters in New York. It had a restaurant. It had a rooftop dining facility, as well as the tower. And then it had an arena that held 12,000 people and could be used alternatively for horse shows, or if the floor was flooded, mock naval battles. So it's a building that provided entertainment sort of all the time. And it was described by Mariana Griswold Van Rensselaer, who's the leading architecture critic in New York at the time, as every New Yorker's dearest possession. Well, it really did change New York, and it changed Stanford White as well, because after this, Stanford White was the most in-demand architect in New York, and commissions were coming in from all over the place. And one of the commissions came in very different from Madison Square Garden, came in from a Presbyterian minister. This is Henry McCracken, who was the chancellor of what was then called the City University of New York. It changed its name to New York University very quickly. And McCracken had a problem. His ambition was to transform, or to grow, as they say, his university from a sort of a small liberal arts university to a large research university on the German model. And there just wasn't enough room in Greenwich Village to do that. And so he bought 43 acres in the Bronx. He hired Stanford White to do a master plan of the campus and to design the initial buildings, and which the first one was the library, now called the Gould Memorial Library. But White came up with a rotunda plan for this, surrounded by the book stacks. And um, if you have a building with a rotunda plan, your next stop is the Pantheon in Rome, said to be the most copied building in Western architecture. Well, every architect who copied the Pantheon would take something a little bit different away from it. McKim looked at it for the Low Library at Columbia, and McKim saw the Pantheon as a space-defining wall, really closing off an entire quarter of a space to define the yard at Columbia. But I think Stanford White looked at the Pantheon really through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson. He saw it as almost an institutional villa that would exist, an object that would exist in space, and therefore had an obligation to be, frankly, much more beautiful. And that is what he chose for the Gould Memorial Library. And this is now said to be the last remaining of the major designs by Stanford White. So it's not only it's a beautiful building, but it's even more important for that respect. The building is now the sort of the center of the campus of the Bronx Community College, although the college hasn't quite figured out how to use it. Everybody likes to look at it, and it's still a useful building. But it's also, for the purposes of our talk, an instructive building, because it shows you how Stanford White used detail. And in that sense, White liked to take detail and use it to such a high degree of density that it approached saturation. That's called a chenot, that sort of trim on top of the pediment. And then look at the roof of the dome, which are these copper shingles that are stamped to look like fish scales. I mean, this is saturated ornament. But then he very quickly sort of moves from this saturation to relatively plain areas of variegated brick or limestone. So he relieves you very, very quickly, but he makes his point with real force when he can. He uses sort of compression and release. In this case, on the entrance stairs to the reading room, you have to go up these stairs, and you probably feel as though the proportions are all wrong, that it's narrower, taller, and steeper than you'd like. But you get to the top of the stair, and you go through those doors at the end, and there is not a single person who goes through those doors who doesn't to take a deep breath and sort of see what Stanford White has accomplished in the way of, in this case, compression and release, if you want to have it. But it's just a magnificent space. This is a city, state, and national landmark. And it used to be filled with books, and now it's used really as a reception space. Well, Stanford White could quote the Pantheon sort of with a different accent. Here with the Madison Square Presbyterian Church, he recreates the Pantheon in a sort of Byzantine form. This was said to be Stanford White's finest building design. It had a tragically short life because of the ambition or needs of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. But it shows right here, it's of Stanford White's compression and release in his use of ornament again, or his density to the point of saturation in the use of ornament, because look at that cornice. I mean, there is not room for a bird to hide in that cornice. But then he quickly moves from there to these large areas of relatively variegated light brick. Um, Stanford White could speak other languages as well. This is the Grand Trianon in Versailles in France, and this was the building that was created so that Louis XIV had a place to entertain his mistresses. And Stanford White takes the general organization of this building, the one-story scale, the solid void solid organization of the massing, the paired columns flanking the arched window, the balustrade atop, and that's what he gives to John Jacob Astor IV up in Rhinebeck, New York, in a building called the Ferncliff Casino. Now, this building was built as a dormitory for the male bachelor guests of the at the Astor's house parties. And if you remember reading the Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, these house parties up the Hudson were really very carefully staged events that were intended to introduce eligible men to eligible women under highly controlled circumstances, of which the sleeping arrangements were certainly the most highly controlled. And so the men were put up in this building, and then about 300 yards away, the women were up in the main house under the watchful eye of Mrs. Astor. And but this building gave a little bit more. It was more than what the French would call a garçonniere. It was a party house because the weather wasn't always reliable in the Hudson Valley. And it has this ballroom, which is big enough to take helicopter lessons in, I'd say. But look at the ornamental vocabulary of this room and think about where each of these elements comes from. I mean, the lay light in the center is a purely neoclassical element. Robert and James Adam would not be ashamed to have that, but it's surrounded by a plaster frame that looks like it's sort of taken from a Botticelli painting. And then the capitals are called French Ionic with those little tassels that dangle off at the fireplace. Looks like it's taken from a military installation. And the transom over the doorways, I would say, says a lot more about the celebrated New England walking tour than it says about Versailles. So here you have Stanford White taking elements from every period, every place, and combining them. And his attitude was that if it looked good and it worked well, he would use it. Stanford White was the original sort of cultural appropriator, something that is looked with disfavor today, but Stanford White did it awfully well. The house has an indoor tennis court, and it has this wonderful swimming pool, which is the first or second swimming pool in America. It would give it a tie with the Biltmore down in North Carolina. But look at that pool. I mean, I can tell you from direct personal experience that if you go swimming in this pool, you think you have died and gone to heaven. But it's so simple. I mean, it's just white marble walls and floor, blue painted ceiling, then it's light and water. Those are the elements that make this space. And the only ornamental accent are those capitals there with the porpoises emerging from the foliates. And Stanford White is able to achieve such a delicate balance that all he needs to animate the space are the 5 capitals. I mean, just amazing. The Stanford White gave his designs so much spirit, but it wasn't just spirit for the sake of jazzing them up. It was always, I think, very thoughtfully tailored to the use and user of each of the designs. And I think the best way you can see that is looking at the clubs that he did in New York City, starting with Century, where here's a club where the membership are painters, sculptors, etchers, journalists, novelists, architects, just the range of the musicians, probably. And what White, with Wells' help, is trying to create is a facade that suggests that what lies on the other side of it sort of replicates the kind of the artistic pitch of Florence in the 15th century. Well, 20 blocks to the south, it's a very different message. This is the Players Club, the club for actors that White created by converting Edwin Booth's townhouse. Now, being an actor was then as now a precarious profession. And so White creates these front doors that suggest that what lies on the other side of them is a world of security and serenity. And that must have been a very, very welcome message to an actor. back on 27th Street and Madison Avenue for the first purpose-built women's club in America. The membership included J.P. Morgan's daughter. White, I think, looked at the early federal period and thought that it was appropriate to associate the kind of the courage and independence of the women who started this club with the courage and independence of the early fathers of the United States. Well, back uptown at 60th Street and Fifth Avenue for J.P. Morgan himself, White created the Metropolitan Club, which is not based on a Renaissance building, but it's based on the Renaissance as kind of diluted by Charles Barry, the designer of the Reform Club in London. So here, I think he takes these Renaissance details, but he presents them in this slightly more familiar way. I mean, a true Renaissance building would be a little bit sort of unfiltered for this group, but he appeals to their Anglophilic tendencies, and I think he really appeals to them with the entrance gates, which look like they might be the entrance gates to Blenheim Palace with a 12-mile driveway on the other side. But no 12-mile driveway. Members would go through those gates in their wagons, turn around and get out and go into the club. But this is a very private domain that is completely transparent. And so we see inside, we see everything that's going on, and we can appreciate these gates just by walking down the street. So this may be a private club, but this is a very public gesture on the part of Stanford White. Well, Stanford White did love these sort of public events, particularly parades. He designed parades. He would design parties. The Washington Arch that he designed was actually designed originally in paper mache and plaster as a temporary fixture for the parade that he designed for the 150th anniversary of the birth of George Washington. But it was so popular that money was raised. They moved the site about 150 feet south to get it into the park and built the thing in marble. And it was the beginning or end of parade for decades, the parades that went up and down Fifth Avenue. You can see it just, this is processional architecture, really recognized. So it made the parade seem as though it was important and that it actually happened. Well, today we can't go through that in our open touring cars, sadly, because they put those bollards in the way. But you can admire the sculptural program. The figures of Washington at War and at Peace down at the bottom were done by the father of Alexander Calder, although after Dwight's death, so he never saw those. But he did see the sculptural program at the top, which was done by Frederick McMonnies. McMonnies was a protege of Saint-Gaudens. He was a very good friend of the Whites and a frequent house guest out at Box Hill, the Whites' house in the country. And I think as repayment for Bessie's hospitality, Frederick McMonnies carves Bessie White in the left-hand spandrel on the north face of the Washington Arch. And it shows that it's very important to invite good sculptors to your house parties because you never can tell how they're going to come up with a way to repay you. Well, White went to a lot of parties and he didn't always like them. He would complain that he had to work all day and then get dressed up and do the party thing at night. You see him in the center there without a big smile on his face. But I think he went to these parties for two reasons. One was to keep an eye on his clients. That's Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish on the right, sitting in the chair. And he did a house for her up on 78th Street and Madison Avenue. But then it's also a way of meeting new clients. Remember, this is where the money was, as the bank robbers would say, and they were the class that represented Stanford White's clients. So he did have to go to these parties, but whether he enjoyed them or not, he was very, very good at them. If you were giving a party and you asked Stanford White to help you, he would design your party for you. If you were at a party in a room designed by Stanford White, I would say you were having more fun because the room was doing half the work. And if you were Tessie Ulrichs, you would get Stanford White to design the greatest single party house in America, which is Rosecliff up in Newport. And this was the house that would allow Tessie to give the best single party in a 60-day social season in Newport. I mean, there's a lot of competition for parties up there, but she wanted to give the one that nobody could say no to. And so if you were lucky enough to get one of those invitations, you'd be driving down the driveway and you would notice that the house was based on the Grand Trianon home, which it is, except that it has an extra story because Tessie has had a lot of house guests. And then you'd also notice that the front door was not in the center of the house, which was absolutely unique among the houses of this period, which were all rigidly sort of bilaterally symmetrical. But here, the front door is all the way over to the right. And that's because what Stanford White had really designed was a machine for giving a party. And the machine starts its work as you get out of your carriage and go through that front door. You come into the vestibule, you go up a few steps, you go through the arch. And then if you're a couple, the men would wait at the base of the stairs while the women went upstairs to sort of look in a mirror, make sure everything was under control, and then they would turn and they would descend the finest staircase in America. And that is not an uncritical superlative, because I defy you to name a better one. Here, you are having the best time at a party you have ever had, and you have not even gotten to the party yet. You have to collect your date, go into the next room, meet the hostess, go into the room after that, and meet the rest of the guests. But Stanford White knew that to have a really great time at a party, you really had to start strong. Well, this house was given for parties too, but it had a dual function because the owners actually lived in this as well. This is the house for Payne and Helen Hay Whitney. It was a wedding present to the Whitneys from Payne Whitney's uncle, Oliver Payne, who gave the couple a blank check and told them to go hire Stanford White and build themselves a nice house. And a request that everybody took extremely seriously, right down to the blank check. It's different from Rosecliff in that many respects, but White just didn't have the room to the runway or whatever to create that transition from outdoors to indoors. So he did it in, I think, an original and extremely clever way, which is this first room that you walk into, which is a square room, walls of white marble. But then within the square is set this circular pavilion that's almost like an outdoor space. It's got a shallow domed ceiling, which is the lattice work that has sort of vines growing in and out of it. It's got emblems of love and fertility sort of spotted around the ceiling. Based on the loggia of the Villa Papagiulia in Rome, but very, very differently presented geometrically. But the same idea that it reads as an outdoor space because the pavilion within the room has no walls. It just has those columns. And then to reinforce the outdoor nature, he put a fountain in the middle, which he made out of elements that he had picked up at various European antique dealers, including the boy in the center, who is now recognized to be the work of the young Michelangelo. So Stanford White had a good eye as well. Now, if you were going to a party at the Whitney's house, you would be directed to the left, that staircase that goes up to the second floor where the party rooms were. But if you were coming to see, by appointment or otherwise, to see Mr. and Mrs. Whitney, you would be directed to that doorway on the right. And you would be brought into what Mrs. Whitney called the Venetian room, which I think considered to be Stanford White's greatest design of an interior, probably the last of the rooms that he designed. But here is a room that represents, I think, so many of the themes that we have been talking about, starting with the idea of light that first reveals detail and then it dissolves it. I mean, this room was dissolving all around you. I mean, it must have been a hallucinogenic experience to be sitting in that room waiting to be called upstairs. And then you have that what I call that estuarial middle ground between architecture and furniture. I mean, is this room a piece of architecture or a piece of furniture? And to reinforce that, he sort of separates the mirrors with these framing elements from neoclassical pier mirrors. And then he uses ornament to a sort of a degree of density that approaches saturation. If you look at the cornice and particularly the the cove above that, which is made out of bronze lattice with these cloisonné roses sort of woven in and out of it, and they would pick up on the clock that's on the mantelpiece. I mean, all of those themes are reflected in this room, and it's all sort of approaching the level of saturation, but at the same time, it is completely coherent. I mean, Stanford White was able to put his foot on the gas and still make sense in a way, almost like leading a thousand-piece orchestra to play Clair de Lune and having it just sound perfect. Well, just as Stanford White could step on the gas, he could also step on the brake. This is the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument in Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn, a commission that was intended to memorialize the 3,000 colonial soldiers who died in prisoner of war ships during the Revolution. It was a really disgraceful episode in warfare. And Stanford White comes to the conclusion that the way to do this is not through this abundance of ornament or any kind of imbalance or any of the things that we've seen so far, but through almost complete silence. The only ornamental element is that lantern on top of the fluted, baseless Tuscan column, and the silence is just amazing. Well, I'm going to finish up with this photograph here, which was taken in September 1905 at a picnic at Box Hill in St. James. There, you see Stanford White sitting on the blanket. Bessie's tugging his ear. You have Charles McKim with his back to the camera, and you have Augustus Saint-Gaudens in the rocking chair behind Bessie, looking at the camera. To the left are James and Frances Breeze, who are friends of the Whites, who were the clients for that house in Southampton that we saw earlier. But what this picture talks about is a theme that we have not discussed and really is not related to architecture, but is so important to Stanford White's life, which is the theme of friendship. I mean, these three men were incredible friends. They just were the best friends you could possibly imagine. I mean, 30 years earlier, they had gone down the Rhone as young redheads to take a look at Romanesque architecture. And now, 30 years later, they were at the absolute pinnacle of their professions. And Charles McKim had just returned from England, where he'd accepted the gold medal from the Royal Institute of British Architects. St. Gaudens was designing the coinage for the United States Mint at the request of Teddy Roosevelt, and Stanford White was the most visible architect in America. And less than a year after this photograph was taken, the whole thing comes apart. Stanford White is shot by a madman. St. Gaudens dies a year later in 1907 of stomach cancer. You can see that he is ailing slightly. And then McKim withdraws from the firm around that time, and his health failing. He dies in 1909, I'm convinced, of a broken heart from the loss of his two best friends. So looking forward, it is a sadness to this picture, but taken at face value, I think it represents this extraordinary period in the history of American architecture, and it has been my pleasure to share it with you. Thank you very much. Jackie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was incredible. We have a few minutes. We can take any questions that anyone may have. And in regards to the chat, I am actually going to share the link to those who registered today by email so that you'll have it more readily. That is both for if you would like to get a copy of the book, I will send a link for that, as well as our programming for this season at St. Gaudens Memorial. Um, and I don't believe there's any questions. I'll take one more minute, but this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so very much, Sam, for sharing with us.
My pleasure. Happy to do it. And come
Excellent.
up to Cornish and see what St. Gaudens has done. I mean, this is what you've seen is just the simulacrum of some extraordinary work. Come to Cornish and really take a look at St. Gaudens in the original.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Sam.
Okay,
No
good.
questions, so we're going to end this and yeah, we'll see you
All
in
right.
Cornish. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, Jackie.
Yes, thank you.